Burkina Faso had officially cleared its $5 billion domestic debt without a single dollar from the IMF, the World Bank, or any Western nation. The world froze. Financial analysts checked their numbers twice. They said it was impossible. They said a country like Burkina Faso could never escape the weight of billions in debt without stretching its hands toward the West. But then something happened, something no financial expert, no global institution, and no geopolitical strategist saw coming. In 2025, a small landlocked nation, often dismissed as poor, did what the world's richest economists call financial suicide and somehow survived it. And not just survived, it rewrote the narrative of African economics in a single announcement. Diplomats scrambled for explanations, and global investors face a truth they weren't prepared for. Burkina Faso had just performed a financial rebellion that shouldn't have been possible, yet was. But the real shock wasn't the amount paid. It was how it was paid, not through foreign donors, not through crushing new loans, not through secret deals with powerful nations, but through something far more dangerous to the global financial order: the power of its own people, its own markets, its own minerals, its own reforms, and its own leadership. This wasn't charity. This wasn't luck. This was strategy, raw, calculated, and executed with precision. The story you're about to hear is not a fairy tale. It is not political propaganda. It is a true account of how an African nation led by a young military captain looked at its mountain of debt and refused to kneel. A nation that chose to trust its miners, its farmers, its traders, its entrepreneurs, its land, its gold, its future, instead of relying on help that always came with strings. But behind this achievement lies a deeper question. How did a country battling terrorism, economic instability, and global pressure manage to pull off one of the greatest financial turnarounds in modern African history? To understand that, we must go back to the moment the debt crisis began, when Burkina Faso realized that the very institutions claiming to rescue Africa had quietly trapped it in a cycle designed not to uplift, but to control. A crisis, decades in the making, a decision that shocked the world, and a leader who refused to bow to the global financial empire. This is the untold story of how Burkina Faso broke free from the chains of dependency and proved that sometimes the greatest revolution isn't fought on the battlefield, but in the balance sheets, the gold mines, the farms, and the hearts of people who refuse to give up on their nation. To understand the magnitude of what happened in 2025, you must first understand the trap Burkina Faso had been living in long before Traoré ever took power. Debt didn't arrive suddenly. It arrived quietly, over decades, layer by layer, loan by loan, crisis by crisis. A silent weight building on the backs of a population that already carried more than enough. Burkina Faso, like many African countries, was told that development required borrowing. Roads? Borrow. Hospitals? Borrow. School systems? Borrow. Military equipment to defend against insurgencies? Borrow again. And every time, the message was the same: we're helping you. But the fine print always said otherwise. Interest rates climbed. Conditions multiplied. Policy control slowly shifted from Ouagadougou to meeting rooms in Washington, Brussels, and Paris. Local leaders were pressured to cut subsidies their people depended on. Foreign consultants flooded ministries, dictating how the economy should function. And worst of all, natural resources, gold, manganese, granite were extracted and exported with minimal benefit returning to the citizens. Debt became more than money owed. It became a mechanism of influence, a subtle but powerful leash. By 2020, Burkina Faso owed billions domestically and billions more externally. The economy was strained, security worries were rising, and corruption deeply rooted in old political structures was making the system bleed from within. Foreign companies were extracting up to 20 tons of gold a year, while the government saw only a fraction of the revenue. High-ranking officials quietly signed contracts that favored outside interests over their own citizens. People felt it. Farmers saw fertilizer prices doubling. Small businesses struggled with banking restrictions created to satisfy foreign lenders. And every year, a larger portion of the national budget went to repaying interest, not investing in development. Then came the turning point. The domestic debt owed to local banks, private investors, businesses, and contractors passed the $5 billion mark. For years, it remained unpaid, creating a chain reaction across the economy. Projects stalled. Infrastructure upgrades froze. Companies stopped hiring. Civil servants waited months for salaries. Trust in the financial system evaporated. This wasn't just a financial crisis. It was a national paralysis. And at the center of this storm stood a country battling terrorism in the north, political instability across its borders, and economic pressure from global institutions that insisted their way was the only way. Many politicians believed there was only one solution. Go back to the IMF, sign another bailout, accept another round of austerity, cut public spending, shrink social programs, trade sovereignty for survival. It was the same formula African nations have been forced to follow for decades. But this time, something was different. Because the man now leading the nation was not a politician. He was a soldier, a strategist, and a leader who didn't fear breaking the established order. When Ibrahim Traoré took the reins, he inherited a financial bomb ticking loudly under the country's feet. The pressure was immediate. Advisors urged him to run straight to Western financial institutions. Diplomats warned him against making emotional decisions. International experts mocked the idea that Burkina Faso could ever stand on its own feet. Behind closed doors, emissaries from global powers delivered veiled threats dressed as recommendations. Some suggested privatizing key natural resources. Others recommended deeper cooperation with foreign mining conglomerates. A few even hinted that failure to comply could affect international support. But Traoré didn't flinch. Instead of repeating the past, he asked a question no leader had dared to ask so boldly. What if we pay our debt without them? At first, the idea seemed unreal, even dangerous. But that question sparked the beginning of a financial rebellion, one that would inspire a continent and terrify those who depended on Africa's dependency. Because what came next was not a miracle. It was a strategy that turned Burkina Faso's weaknesses into advantages, its people into investors, and its natural resources into leverage. This was the moment where the story changed, when a country known for its struggles decided to fight back financially, without firing a single shot. The decision to attempt the impossible, paying off billions of dollars in domestic debt without a single foreign loan, did not begin in a boardroom. It began in silence. In a dimly lit office inside the presidential palace, Ibrahim Traoré sat surrounded by stacks of financial files, budget reports, and documents detailing decades of economic dependency. Outside, the city of Ouagadougou buzzed with its usual rhythm, unaware that inside those walls, a different rhythm was forming, a strategy that would challenge the global financial hierarchy. Traoré understood one thing better than any economist. Numbers don't lie, but the people behind those numbers often do. Burkina Faso's financial crisis, when stripped of political noise and foreign influence, came down to a single, devastating truth: most of the debt owed by the government was not foreign. It was domestic. Contractors had never been paid for public works. Local banks had lent money they thought would return in months, not years. Small businesses completed government projects, but never received a single coin. Pension funds were stretched thin because the state had borrowed from them to keep salaries flowing. This was not a crisis created by the people. It was a crisis suffered by them. Traoré realized that if he could repair the relationship between the state and its people, if he could rebuild trust, then perhaps Burkina Faso would find the room it needed to breathe financially. But that required confronting a painful reality. The state had failed its own citizens long before it ever borrowed from the outside world. In meetings with his economic team, heated debates erupted over how to proceed. Some advisors insisted that domestic debt was the least urgent problem. External creditors had deadlines, interest rates, and diplomatic weight. Domestic creditors, they argued, could wait. But Traoré rejected the logic instantly. How could a nation stand if the very people supporting it had been abandoned? He didn't want a quick fix. He wanted a foundation. So he asked for historical data stretching back 30 years. He wanted to see every debt, every unpaid invoice, every delayed project, every contract drowned in corruption. And what he found was startling. Not only was domestic debt enormous, but much of it was artificially inflated by corrupt intermediaries and foreign mining companies who pushed local politicians into signing exploitive deals. This was not simply an economic crisis. It was economic sabotage. Traoré saw clearly that paying off domestic debt wasn't just a financial responsibility, it was a political statement. It was a declaration that Burkina Faso would rebuild itself from the inside out. It was a promise to every contractor, farmer, banker, trader, and citizen that their work mattered and that their trust had value. But knowing what to do was one thing. Figuring out how to do it was another challenge entirely. The first major step was to restructure the mining sector, a system long controlled by foreign companies who extracted gold worth billions while leaving Burkina Faso with crumbs. Traoré visited mining sites himself. He listened to miners speak about missing wages, manipulated scales, and hidden shipments transported out of the country without proper inspection. He saw warehouses filled with minerals that were never officially recorded. He discovered gold refineries disguised as logistics centers and loopholes that allowed tons of resources to be smuggled across borders. Burkina Faso was rich, far richer than anyone had been allowed to see. The problem was not scarcity. The problem was theft. Traoré realized that the mining sector alone could finance a large portion of the domestic debt if it were properly controlled. So he began nationalizing certain operations, renegotiating contracts, canceling predatory agreements, and tightening border controls. Foreign companies were furious. Ambassadors complained. Letters arrived daily warning of economic consequences. But Traoré pushed forward with an iron determination. Not all the gold leaving Burkina Faso was smuggled by criminals. Some was smuggled legally, hidden under protection of special agreements signed by previous politicians who traded the country's wealth for campaign funding or foreign support. Traoré dissolved these agreements overnight. Revenue began to rise, slowly at first, then dramatically. Simultaneously, the government launched a financial transparency initiative unlike anything the region had seen before. For the first time, citizens could track public spending line by line. They could see which contractors were paid, which projects were greenlit, and how mining revenue was redistributed. Trust began to return not from speeches, but from evidence. But the boldest move Traoré made was one that shocked economists across the continent. He turned to the people and asked them to become investors, not donors, not charity givers, investors. He introduced a national solidarity bond open to farmers, taxi drivers, teachers, shop owners, diaspora communities, and local businesses. It wasn't charity. It was a chance for Burkinabe citizens to buy shares in their own nation's recovery. The bond promised modest returns, guaranteed by increased mining revenues and state assets. It was designed not to burden the poor, but to empower the middle class and strengthen local banks. And something extraordinary happened. People lined up. Villages pooled money. Communities organized themselves. The diaspora sent contributions from Europe, the U.S., and neighboring African countries. Within months, millions had been raised domestically, not from corporations, but from citizens who believed in the vision of a sovereign Burkina Faso. Foreign observers were stunned. Some mocked the initiative as populist economics, but they were wrong. It wasn't populism. It was ownership. Traoré understood something crucial. People invest in what they believe belongs to them. The more the people invested, the more the economy stabilized. Banks slowly regained liquidity. Contractors restarted halted construction projects. Schools resumed expansion. Hospitals reopened wings that had been abandoned for years. And across the nation, a sense of pride long buried by decades of dependency began to rise again. Still, this transformation wasn't without resistance. Foreign diplomats began warning of regional instability. Western financial institutions suddenly expressed concern about the economic direction of Burkina Faso. Some lobbied for sanctions. Others threatened to delay development funds. Intelligence reports showed attempts to bribe local officials into sabotaging reforms. Traoré faced pressure from every direction, but none of it slowed him down. In private meetings, he reminded his team of one truth: a nation that fears independence will never achieve it. As revenues grew and domestic debt began shrinking, Something even more significant happened. Burkina Faso's currency began to stabilize. Inflation slowed. Local markets revived. Small businesses started hiring again. Farmers gained access to subsidized fertilizer produced domestically instead of imported at inflated prices. This wasn't just financial recovery. It was psychological liberation. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso was shaping its own destiny without permission, without loans, without the voice of foreign experts dictating its future. And as the debt continued to fall month after month, countries around the region took notice. Mali, Niger, Guinea, and others began studying the model. African economists, once skeptical, began calling it the Burkinabe method. Traoré was invited to speak at regional summits. Young Africans across the continent started using his speeches as inspiration in classrooms and community meetings. Burkina Faso, the nation once dismissed as fragile and dependent, was becoming the blueprint for a new African economic awakening. But the boldest chapter, the moment the world finally turned its head, was still approaching the day Traoré announced the impossible. The day he declared the entire $5 billion domestic debt was paid. Momentum can be a dangerous thing when it shifts in favor of those who were never meant to win. As Burkina Faso's economic recovery accelerated, international observers began to realize that this wasn't a temporary surge or an emotional political wave. It was a construction of a new financial architecture, one that didn't answer to the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, or the silent oversight of Western economic advisors. It was a system built from the ground up, designed in Africa, funded by Africans and accountable to Africans alone. Inside foreign embassies in Ouagadougou, analysts struggled to understand how a country with limited resources, ongoing security threats, and a history of political turbulence was managing to outperform their projections. Some assumed the numbers were manipulated. Others suspected hidden foreign backers. But they all missed the truth that was unfolding in front of them. The people were the backers. The people were the lenders. The people were the guarantors. The people were the plan. In rural areas, community leaders organized themselves into cooperative investment groups. Farmers who had survived on thin margin for decades contributed small amounts, not because they believed they would get rich from it, but because it was the first time anyone had asked them to be part of the national story. In towns like Bobo del Lasso, merchants and small business owners held weekly gatherings to track how much debt had been paid and how much remained. It became a movement, a form of patriotic economics rooted in the simple belief that a nation belongs to those willing to build it. This movement ignited a cultural shift just as powerful as a financial one. Songs were written about economic sovereignty. Artists painted murals celebrating miners, farmers, and factory workers. Schools began teaching lessons on national self-reliance. Local radio stations held discussions about transparency and domestic empowerment. Burkina Faso wasn't just paying its debt, it was rewriting its identity. Meanwhile, inside the presidential circle, Traoré intensified his reforms. He demanded audits of every government ministry. Contracts that had drained public funds were canceled. Ghost projects, roads paid for but never built. Schools budgeted but never constructed. Bridges that existed only on paper were exposed to the public. The shock rippled across the nation. Billions had been lost through corruption, mismanagement, or outright theft. People were furious, but their anger didn't lead to despair. It led to clarity. For the first time in decades, the truth was not a secret. The government wasn't hiding behind excuses or blaming foreign conditions. They put the evidence on display for all to see and asked the nation to help repair what had been broken. Trust rose not because the government was perfect, but because it was honest. The impact was felt immediately in the financial sector. Local banks, once suffocated by unpaid government loans, suddenly had room to breathe. Liquidity returned. Interest rates stabilized. The central bank reported improved reserves. And as confidence surged, private sector investment increased not from abroad, but from Burkinabe entrepreneurs who had once feared government instability. The entire financial ecosystem began to function like a living organism coming back to life after years of suffocation. But while the internal economy strengthened, external pressure mounted. Foreign mining companies that once operated with near total freedom faced strict regulations. Traoré demanded transparency in gold exports, mandatory reporting of mineral extractions, and fair revenue sharing. Some companies reluctantly complied. Others retaliated. They filed complaints through diplomatic channels, warning of investor insecurity. A few quietly threatened to shut down operations entirely, believing the government would panic at the possibility of losing foreign investment. But the government didn't panic. They adapted. When one foreign mining company halted operations, expecting the state to plead for their return, something unexpected happened. Burkinabe engineers stepped in. Local miners took over. Communities surrounding the site mobilized to support operations. Production slowed, but it didn't stop. The message was unmistakable. Burkina Faso was no longer held hostage by foreign corporations. And for the first time, foreign powers realized that this wasn't simply the rise of a new leader. It was the rise of a new model, one that threatened decades of geopolitical leverage. Behind closed doors, intelligence briefings described Traoré as unpredictable, strategically defiant, and dangerously inspirational. Reports circulated warning that the Burkinabe example could spread across West Africa, undermining Western influence in the Sahel region. In Europe and America, analysts debated how Burkina Faso's debt repayment would impact the role of the IMF and World Bank. If one of Africa's poorest nations could break free without loans, what would stop others from doing the same? Meanwhile, in the streets of Ouagadougou, people weren't thinking about geopolitics. They were thinking about progress. They saw new roads being paved. They saw local businesses expanding. They saw young people returning from abroad to invest at home. They saw pride returning to their nation. Hope, once fragile, had become contagious. At the same time, Traoré's decision to expand local manufacturing triggered a wave of industrial growth. Factories that had been abandoned were refurbished. Small-scale industries producing textiles, agricultural equipment, and construction materials received government subsidies. This shift wasn't about nationalism, it was about economic logic. Every product manufactured locally meant fewer imports, less foreign dependency, and more domestic jobs. Within 2 years, Burkina Faso reduced its import bill significantly. Within 3 years, it increased domestic production across key industries. Within 4 years, it had paid off more than half its domestic debt. But the true turning point came when a confidential financial report reached Traoré's desk. For the first time in modern history, Burkinabe mining revenue had surpassed the country's total foreign aid intake. The report stated, in simple terms, that Burkina Faso could fully finance its budget if mining operations remained transparent and nationally controlled. Foreign donors were no longer the backbone of the Burkinabe economy. The nation itself was. The implications were enormous. Traoré knew that once the country demonstrated financial independence, foreign interference would intensify, so he accelerated his reforms even further. He encouraged the creation of the West African Solidarity Corridor, an economic cooperation pact with neighboring nations to promote resource sharing, coordinated exports, and joint infrastructure development. He signed new agreements with African financial institutions instead of Western ones. He supported regional banking networks designed to reduce reliance on the CFA franc. These steps formed the foundation of an economic shield, one that protected Burkina Faso's sovereignty just as much as the military protected its borders. And as months passed, as debt continued to fall, and as the economy stabilized, the global narrative began to shift. Financial analysts who once dismissed Traoré's plan as unrealistic began calling it the most significant economic turnaround in modern African history. African youth across the continent praised his leadership, not because he claimed to fight for sovereignty, but because he proved sovereignty was achievable. Yet through all the changes, Traoré remained cautious. He knew that success attracts two things: admiration from the oppressed and resistance from the powerful. As Burkina Faso inched closer to erasing its entire domestic debt, he understood that the final phase would be the most difficult. Paying off the last $1 billion would require absolute discipline. No corruption, no political missteps, no foreign manipulation. It was a moment when nations either crumble under pressure or rise to rewrite the future. And Burkina Faso was about to rise. The streets of Ouagadougou hum with a different kind of noise now. Not the noise of uncertainty, nor the anxious murmurs that once floated through markets, bus stations, and dusty village roads. Today it is a noise made of something rarer, something nations often seek for decades without ever truly capturing it. It is the sound of a country rediscovering itself, the kind of quiet confidence that grows when people realize they have survived without the help they were told they could never live without. Across the capital, you can feel the transformation in the way people walk, the way vendors set up their stalls, the way workers step into newly constructed factories and administrative buildings with a sense of participation, not resignation. For the first time in generations, the eyes of ordinary Burkinabe no longer carry the memory of imposed limitations. They carry the possibility of tomorrow. This new reality did not emerge overnight. It was sculpted, piece by piece, through sacrifices that few outside the continent ever truly saw or understood. It began with a decision, one that seemed reckless to outsiders, but felt inevitable to those who had lived the consequences of foreign dependency for 60 years. The decision to rely first on Burkinabe hands, Burkinabe resources, and Burkinabe belief. When the government announced that the domestic debt had been cleared, the world treated it as an anomaly, a miracle even. Analysts framed it as a curious experiment. Skeptics called it unsustainable, and critics insisted the numbers must be hiding something. But on the ground, within Burkina Faso itself, no one looked shocked. The people who had sacrificed, contributed, invested, and worked knew exactly how it had happened. It wasn't magic. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't luck. It was a simple outcome of a monumental collective effort that had started with the belief that a nation's dignity begins where its dependency ends. The repayment of the $5 billion debt was not the finish line. It was the first proof of concept evidence that a country long dismissed as needing constant rescue could, in fact, rescue itself. For the rural farmer who donated part of his yearly harvest to the National Development Fund, it meant more than numbers. For him, the announcement symbolized that his sacrifice was not swallowed by bureaucracy, not lost in corruption, not forgotten by the state. His contribution had helped turn the wheels of a financial revolution. And when he told his children about it that evening over a small fire outside his home, he spoke with a pride he had never felt before, the pride of someone who was not a victim of history, but a participant in it. For the young entrepreneurs who invested in local mining startups instead of sending their money abroad, the announcement validated a risk they took when everyone told them it would fail. They had placed their trust in a system that had never previously given them reason to. And yet, here they were, witnessing returns not just in profit, but in national empowerment. For the soldiers at the border, the engineers building new roads, the doctors who stayed during shortages, the teachers who worked without full pay for months, the announcement meant something far deeper. It meant that for once, their sacrifices were not treated as background noise in a global story. They were the story. And yet, beneath the celebration, there lies an uncomfortable truth, one that the documentary cannot ignore. The path Burkina Faso chose is not one that all nations will dare to walk. It is steep, unforgiving, politically risky, and economically fragile. It requires a level of unity and trust between the government and its people that many nations find nearly impossible to maintain. It demands discipline in a world addicted to shortcuts. It demands self-sacrifice in a world accustomed to convenience. And above all, it demands the courage to endure long periods of uncertainty without collapsing into fear. Such courage is not common, but in this case, it proved contagious. With the debt cleared, the government began reinvesting aggressively into local industries. New mines, no longer leased out cheaply to foreign corporations, were now operated by joint ventures where Burkinabe workers, engineers, and managers held majority control. Revenue that once flowed outward began to circulate within the borders, fueling jobs, education, and infrastructure. The new hydropower facilities, funded through domestic bonds, started to supply electricity to regions that had never seen stable power before. Factories processing cotton, cashew, and gold increased national value add drastically, reducing reliance on raw material exports that had trapped the country in poverty for decades. The reforms weren't perfect. Mistakes were made. Not every project succeeded. Some initiatives took longer than planned. Others faced local disputes, and a few collapsed under financial pressure. But for the first time, those failures were owned internally, not dictated by foreign creditors, not punished through structural adjustment, not tied to political conditions that undermined sovereignty. They were simply the growing pains of a country learning to walk without crutches. This shift in mentality, the idea that failure is part of growth instead of a justification for external control, was perhaps the greatest victory of all. Outside Africa, the reaction remained mixed. Some celebrated Burkina Faso as a model for economic independence, a case study proving that with discipline and unity, even small nations could rewrite their destiny. Others dismissed it as an unsustainable anomaly, predicting eventual collapse unless the country returned to a familiar cycle of loans and aid. Institutions hinted that ignoring global financial norms would lead to isolation, while think tanks questioned the transparency of the reforms. But inside Burkina Faso, those debates did not matter. What mattered was the lived reality of the citizens, a reality that no external opinion could invalidate. The repayment of $5 billion was symbolic, yes, but also profoundly practical. It removed a burden that had restricted national growth for generations. It freed the government from interest payments that consumed budgets year after year. And most importantly, it shattered the psychological barrier that had convinced Africans for decades that progress must come from outside. From one coastal fishing community to another bustling mining town, from urban tech hubs to remote agricultural regions, the message spread. If we can do this, we can do more. And so the final chapter of the story is not about money or numbers or debt. It is about something far more valuable, the restoration of belief. A belief that a nation can define its future without bowing to external pressures. A belief that sovereignty is not a slogan but a responsibility. A belief that development is not a gift handed down, but a collective effort rising upward. As the documentary draws to a close, the camera slowly captures a panoramic view of the capital at dusk. The sky turns orange, then a deep red, then a calming blue. Streetlights flicker on, one by one, illuminating new roads, renovated markets, and monuments that were once abandoned but now restored. In that gentle transition from day to night, the entire journey of the country is reflected: the struggle, the darkness, the uncertainty, and then the emergence of light through cracks. There are no grand speeches, no triumphant declarations, no dramatic orchestral swells. Just a country quietly standing taller than it ever has. Burkina Faso, once labeled poor, unstable, dependent, and hopeless, now stands as a reminder that nations rise not when the world approves, but when the people within refuse to surrender. And in that simple, powerful truth lies a lesson the world wasn't expecting to learn. As the final scene fades, the message left behind is one that extends far beyond borders, continents, and political divides. When a people believe in themselves more than the world believes in their weakness, even the most impossible debt becomes nothing more than a chapter in a much larger story, the story of a nation reclaiming its destiny. The screen fades to black, a heartbeat of silence. Then a single line appears. A new Africa is possible. It begins with belief.